I recently read a biography of Louis XVI. In this biography, the author retraces the life of the king in a chronological manner, describing his personality, his character traits, and trying to explain the choices he made when he reigned over France. Here is the detailed summary of this book. The book begins in an unusual way. It is a kind of a flash forward. The author speaks to us about the last night and the last morning of Louis XVI, how he confesses, how he goes to the scaffold, and how he is executed. The question that occupied his mind during that morning was whether or not the metropolis had received news from a ship that had gone to explore distant islands. In this opening scene, the author presents Louis XVI as someone who is calm, stoic, who is not afraid in the face of death, and who, Louis XVI, even shows scientific curiosity. The author calls this a successful ending. After this introductory scene, the story of Louis XVI begins, told in a chronological way. The childhood of Louis XVI. We discover that Louis XVI was a boy who was not loved by his parents and who originally was not destined for the throne. Indeed, the future Louis XVI had a physical appearance that was considered rather ungainly and a fragile health. He had an elder brother who was handsome and self-confident. His brother was promised the throne, destined to become king of France later on. But during his childhood, this elder brother fell from a toy, injured his hip, and as a result of complications, he died. It is then that from one day to the next, Louis XVI becomes the heir. The future Louis XVI is, so to speak, placed under the spotlight. By the way, his real name is Louis Auguste, but at the time of his coronation, he will abandon Auguste and we know him as Louis XVI. In short, the story continues, and unfortunately, the future Louis XVI loses his parents as they die from illnesses. The author explains that in those ancient times, anyone, even aristocrats, even princes of the blood, had a high risk of dying from disease, because illnesses were everywhere and medicine was rudimentary. Then the deaths around Louis XVI follow one after another. After the death of his parents, Louis XVI's childhood is unhappy. He has a reserved character. He is shy and appears to be a person without great stature. He speaks little. Influential people at the court of the King of France at that time advised what the future Louis XVI should be educated according to very strict moral and religious principles. Throughout his entire life, Louis XVI would remain deeply believing. The future Louis XVI learns his moral, religious, scientific lessons, and so on. But curiously, he becomes passionate about manual work and especially about the making of locks. During this part of the book, we discover the personality of Louis XVI in a greater depth. He was not a really bad person, but rather a contradictory personality. He was a prince of the blood, destined to become king one day, but he loved locksmithing. He was reserved and taciturn, but it sometimes happened that he responded and reacted in a sudden, even violent way without reason. He had cruel pastimes, such as pushing his servants under a water sprinkler in the garden or tickling an old servant who was particularly ticklish. Later on, he would be attached to his quality and dignity as king. He would always remain pious, but he would be interested in and show himself favorable to the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers. And he would support the American Revolution. But we will see that a little later. In short, Louis XVI has an incoherent personality, which is perhaps even more serious than being evil, especially for someone who governs a country. In short, if what the author says is accurate, it appears that it was bad luck that a person like Louis XVI became King of France. Then comes an essential episode in the life of Louis XVI, his marriage to Marie-Antoinette. Marie-Antoinette was sent to France by her parents, the monarchs of Austria, in order to exert influence over the future King of France, who would be her husband. She's charming, but poorly educated. She has read only a few light novels. All her life, she will seek pleasure, flee her responsibilities. She's interested in only one thing: having fun. Later, she will be reproached for behaving like a courtesan rather than like a queen. As for her influence over Louis XVI, during their life together, Marie Antoinette will never succeed in having a real influence over her husband. But curiously, she will claim to exert influence. So why? She herself will explain it in a letter. If other people are not convinced that I have influence over my husband, then I will lose the last thing I have: other people's belief in my influence. But all that will come later. Let us continue the story where we left it. The very young Marie Antoinette arrives in France. She makes a good impression on the king of the time, Louis XV, who, by the way, was not the father of the future Louis XVI. From the very beginning, Louis XVI is extremely shy with Marie Antoinette. Celebrations are organized, the young people dance, then comes the moment of the first conjugal night. During that night, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are very tired and they do not make love. But here arises an embarrassing problem. The issue is that for almost 10 years, during the first years of their marriage, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette will have no sexual relations. They are unable to consummate their union. A physical malformation of the prince is suspected. People at court even comes to think that Louis XVI has a malformation of the genital organs, because of which he cannot have relations with Marie Antoinette. Louis XVI is examined several times over several years by doctors, But the doctors discover no physiological anomaly. The problem is that the future Louis XVI was paralyzed by his shyness. It is only several years later that Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette will succeed in sleeping together, and afterward they will have children. Next, we see how Louis XVI was crowned King of France and how he supported the American Revolution and the War of Independence. It should be known that just before that, France had lost a war, the 7 Years' War. England had triumphed, and France's defeat had been felt as very humiliating. Louis XVI, who, by the way, was probably a Freemason, later, after the revolution, Masonic objects would be discovered in his possession, such as a Masonic compass, was therefore won over to the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers and would support the United States against England. France first clandestinely and then openly sent weapons and gunpowders to America. Toward the end of the war, France sent several thousand men who fought on the American side. The decisive battle was fought on land and at sea. French ships blocked British ships in a location that prevented them from landing and massacring the American army. In the end, the British failed to crush the American insurgents, and 2 treaties of Paris were signed. One treaty between the United States and France, and another between the United States and England. France had won, and the humiliation it has suffered during the previous war, the 7 Years' War, seemed erased. The problem for Louis XVI was that the United States, which had gained their independence, were a republic, and even a republic with democratic elements in gestation. What would happen is that the people in France, the public opinion in a world, would look at the United States with interest. The idea would grow in people's mind. Why not do in France what the United States had managed to accomplish? Establish a republic. The Americans did it. Why not us? Before the United States, republics already existed in Europe, the merchant republics of northern Italy and the Netherlands. But these old European republics were considered uninteresting because they were oligarchic. In short, the most important point is this. Louis XVI contributed to the victory of the United States, and by doing so, he made his own future downfall a little more possible. He contributed to his own future fall. Then we see how 2 very important things happen. First, the people of Paris begin to hate Marie-Antoinette. She is reproached for spending too much, for having too much influence over her husband, and for not behaving like a worthy Queen of France. The second thing is that France is extremely indebted, and Louis XVI decides to place at the head of his ministers a man who will carry out fiscal reforms. The problem is that the courtiers spend too much money. Too much money is invested in the army and in other things, whether necessary or not. The great aristocratic families of France do not pay taxes. The city parliaments, there were institutions like this in ancient regime France, block all the king's initiatives. Louis XVI will try to appoint people to manage public finances, but it is chaos. First, Louis XVI places at the head of the government a Swiss banker, Necker. Necker appears effective, but court intrigues and the intrigues of powerful French families bring about his downfall. Then Louis XVI successively appoints 3 or 4 other ministers, more or less competent, in most cases not competent at all. Each time, intrigues bring down the ministers. Moreover, and this is more serious, the parliaments and the great families irresponsibly and selfishly block all projects whose purpose is to make the nobles pay taxes and also to reduce their power. The author explains this very well, and we see how shocking the behavior or the great families of the kingdom is. France was in a desperate financial state, but the high nobility would do everything possible to prevent problems from being solved, because above all they selfishly wanted not to pay and to keep all powers, particularly by blocking royal initiatives that were nevertheless aimed at the general interest. In short, the financial problem seems to have no solution. The situation becomes more and more critical. Everyone, and when I say everyone, I mean the aristocrats, everyone acts for himself without caring about the general interest. Meanwhile, Louis XVI himself imagines and tries to implement other reforms, notably the abolition of torture practiced on people accused by the police of crimes. This was a form of torture that was at the time widely practiced before police interrogations. Judicial reforms are one thing, but as soon as Louis XVI again wants to implement fiscal reforms, he runs into a wall. That is, assemblies of nobles who violently rejects any reform that requires any effort on their part. The noble families stubbornly refuse all reform. During these real battles before the assemblies of nobles, one thing becomes apparent. The ancient regime was not a system in which the king's power was feared and despotic. At one point, the nobles even say that France should be de-Bourbonized. Bourbon was the family name of Louis XVI. Thus, the ancient regime was very different from what one might imagine, namely a totalitarian regime close to those of the 20th century, in which poor and rich would live in a permanent fear. Then the author addresses the episode of Louis XVI's life in which he convenes the Estates General. This was a kind of assembly in which deputies representing all the inhabitants of the kingdom sat. The opening session is already a disaster. The preacher humiliates the third estate. At the very beginning of the Estates General, a ceremony is organized in a church. On this occasion, the clergyman who officiates delivers a homily. In this homily, he commits two imprudences that will be very poorly received. On the one hand, in a medieval manner, he addresses the king, saying that he must show respect to the nobility and the clergy and receive the humble supplications of the third estate. That already does not go over well. Then the clergyman turns toward Marie-Antoinette, who is also present in the church, and says that the problems come from those who spend money without restraint, while the people are dying of hunger. In doing so, he turns everyone against the queen and therefore against King Louis XVI. He electrifies and inflames the situation. I did not understand why he did this. It seems as if he did everything possible to make the situation degenerate. During the Estates General, the primary issue is that the majority of aristocrats want the three orders, the nobility, the clergy, and the third estate, that is, the people, the commoners, to sit in separate places and to vote by order. One vote for the nobility, one for the clergy, and one for the third estate. The representatives of the third estate, on the other hand, want all three orders to sit together in a single assembly and to vote by head, which would benefit the third estate since the commoners represent the majority of deputies. There is blockage and contempt from the aristocrats, but after several days of confrontation and chaos, the third estate declares that it represents 96% of the inhabitants of France, declares himself the National Assembly, declares that it will give France a constitution, and declares that it will henceforth be the authority governing France. Louis XVI tries to calm everyone, but reacts very little to what resembles a coup d'etat by the assembly. And he even ends up accepting this new situation. From that point on, everything accelerates. Whereas just a few days earlier, Louis XVI was considered an absolute king, God's representative on earth, a nearly untouchable, sacred being. That same Louis XVI, because of the unfolding of events, loses his aura in a matter of days. A few days later, the National Assembly, that is the third estate, joined by a few enlightened aristocrats, declares that from now on the king has only a suspensive power to sign or not sign the laws passed by the assembly. Events unfold very quickly, and because of Louis XVI's inaction, one could say his half consent to everything happening before his eyes, Louis XVI loses the essential part of his power. In fact, as the author of the biography explains, there is one particular reason why Louis XVI did not react. At the same time, one of his children was dying. Indeed, his child died a few days later. The author highlights another point. Louis XVI always refused to shed the blood of his subjects, although there were nevertheless some occasions when soldiers charged the crowd in Paris, resulting in several dozen wounded. The author tells us that on several occasions Louis XVI had one idea in mind. It would not be politically wise to disperse the people by the army because he did not want to further inflame the situation. From then on, Louis XVI was ancestors had been absolute kings and who himself had been an absolute king just days earlier, sees his authority reduced to a single thing: signing and approving the decisions of the National Assembly. The author tells us that in the situation, if Louis XVI had been more politically skillful, he could have played his cards well and accepted the role of a symbolic figure of France. But Louis XVI did not have the necessary skill. Deep down, he never accepted the principles instituted by the revolution. He will attempt to flee the capital. With the help of aristocrats who supported absolute monarchy, Louis XVI disguises himself as a simple servant and flees in a horse-drawn carriage toward Belgium with his entire family. His accomplices produce and give him a false passport. While crossing eastern France, Louis XVI stops at a tavern. Suspicions arise in the mind of the tavern keeper, and after observing Louis XVI's portrait on a banknote, the tavern keeper realizes that the client is the king himself. However, he fails to catch Louis XVI, who has already left. The tavern keeper sets off in pursuit and takes a route that allows him to arrive faster than Louis XVI in the next town. The tavern keeper alerts the authorities. The authorities check Louis XVI passport. Everything appears in order and they are about to let him go. Then an unfortunate circumstance occurs. By chance, someone passes by who had met the king years earlier in the court of Versailles. This passerby recognizes Louis XVI, kneels, and begins addressing him as a monarch. Everyone then understands that the traveler is none other than Louis XVI. He is immediately arrested and sent back to Paris. In this part of the book, the reader's earlier impression is confirmed. Louis XVI was an incoherent, strange person with strange and inconsistent behavior. Because of his behavior and because of the sequence of events, he made the worst possible choices. He declared himself for the people, yet listened to and approved those around him who were absolutists. He publicly accepted the preeminence of the National Assembly and the new order of things, then tried to reach Belgium fleeing secretly like a criminal, worse than that, dressed as a servant. In short, he could either have passively accepted the role of a symbolic king in a constitutional monarchy. That would have been good, coherent, acceptable. Or he could have shown courage and character, openly declaring that he did not recognize all the innovation introduced by the assembly and that he wanted the assembly and the people to stop introducing new measures. Otherwise, he would abdicate. Perhaps that would have an effect on the people and the intellectual elites, and the revolution could have been stopped. But Louis XVI did the worst thing possible. He was contradictory in his words and actions. Indeed, the author explains Louis XVI was often reproached for playing a double game. Let us return to the episode of Louis XVI's flight. This episode is very important because after his flight, the people see Louis XVI differently. The people are shocked that the king fled France like a common fugitive. This is surprising and unworthy. All the more so because he disguised himself as a servant. In the eyes of the people, Louis XVI degraded himself. This episode broke the bond that united in the people's mind the King of France and France itself. A Republican club is quickly founded. At first, only a very small minority wants France to become a republic. But as time passes, more and more people want the monarchy abolished and France to become a republic. Then events accelerate. A coalition of foreign princes threatens the people of Paris and all of France, declaring that if harm comes to the king, Paris will be razed and the guilty punished. Eventually, war breaks out between France on one side and Prussia and Austria on the other. At first, there are Austro-Prussian victories, but later two major French armies meet at Valmy and defeat Prussia. The impact of this victory is enormous, because until then Prussian armies were considered invincible. Thanks to the victory at Valmy, the people in Paris and the provinces are reassured and galvanized. But in Paris, a change occurs. The crowd, the people of the street, gain greater political importance. And soon what happens, as the author puts it, is the victory of the street over the assembly. The crowd first storms the Tuileries Palace and massacres all the Swiss guards present there. This is the day of August 10th, 1792. Just before, Louis XVI had fled the Tuileries Palace and taken refuge with the assembly, believing he would be safer among the deputies than everywhere else. As a result of the seizure of the Tuileries and the all-powerfulness of the street of the poorest, the more virulent, the more extremist, the sans-culotte, the National Assembly proclaims the Republic. Louis XVI is ultimately imprisoned. Then a kind of paranoia seizes the people who fled various places, especially the prisons, and assassinates everyone there. The idea in the minds of the killers is that accomplices of Louis XVI are imprisoned and that if they are not killed now, they will eventually join the king and massacre the population of Paris. In reality, those who are massacred are mostly marginal figures, prostitutes and petty criminals imprisoned for minor offenses. Louis XVI is in prison and his trial begins. He is judged by the National Assembly, which assumes the role of judge. 4 questions are put to the Assembly. Is Louis XVI guilty of conspiring with foreign monarchs? Should the people be asked to rule on his guilt? What sentence should be imposed? And finally, should he be granted a reprieve? After long debates, the Assembly declares Louis XVI guilty, rules that it is not necessary to consult the people, sentences him to death, and decides that there is no reason to grant a reprieve. Louis XVI is then executed. End of the biography.